As the name test cutting implies, you are testing something. Or are you? And if you are you actually testing what you are thinking you are testing? In this video, I'll be taking a look at test cutting and the different variables it has, and how you can test a specific one of those. I will also take a quick look at sort reviews and competitions, as those are supposed to test something specific. When you are test cutting, there are three main variables: the sort, the target, and the skill of the user. To test one of those, you need to eliminate the other two. If you want to test the sort, you need to keep the target and the user skill the same. More about this in the sort review section. If you want to test the target, you need to keep the sort and the user skill the same. If you want to test user skill, you need to keep the sort and the target the same. More about this in the competition section. Naturally, the difference these variables can make, well, varies. Does it really matter if you soak your tatami exactly the same time, or can it be just close enough? Well, let's take a look. Let's start the sort section with maybe a bit controversial take. Swords and sharpness are two different things, and you need to make a decision. Are you testing the sword or are you testing the sharpness? If a sword is used, and in some cases just handled, its sharpness will change over its lifetime. Basically, if you cut with a sword, it will dull. And if you want to get it sharp enough, you have to sharpen it. Because of this, if you are trying to test a sword, you should not test the sharpness. The sharpness must be taken out of the equation. More about this in the sword review section. As said, the sharpness of the sword will change if it's used. Because of that, if you own swords and use them for cutting, you actually need to either learn to sharpen a sword or find someone who will sharpen the sword for you. But you basically have to choose one of those options. Or you just have to, I don't know, buy a new sword whenever your current one dulls, and that's really not a good idea. So, what does the sharpness actually mean? So, I'm not talking about the blade geometry or the acuteness of the edge. I'm talking about the sharpness, well, given, or in other words, how fine is the edge? How fine the edge is simply means how little microserration there is at the edge of the blade. To consider a blade sharp to begin with, at least in my opinion, it must have an edge. That means that if you take a look along the blade or along the edge of the blade, there should be no light reflecting from the edge itself. In my opinion, this is the minimum requirement for a sword to be considered sharp instead of a blunt. Naturally, it is good to remember that the definition in law might differ in different countries, but this is my definition. Now that we agree on what a sharp sword is, how do we define how sharp it is? As said, sharpness is basically the amount of microserration on the edge. The more there is, the duller the sword is, and the less there is, the sharper it is. Basically, the angle of the edge doesn't really make any difference here. Acute angle or a more wide angle, both can have a shaving sharp edge. It basically makes no difference in this case. Of course, it makes a difference when cutting, but that is different from sharpness. Another question to answer about sharpness is that can the blade actually support a very sharp edge. Basically, is the combination of the edge profile and the steel such that it can actually take and hold an edge. For example, if the blade has too soft steel, it is quite likely that the sword dulls so fast that it makes no difference at all, even though you actually sharpen it up to a shaving sharp edge, because after a cut or few, it's going to lose that edge. From here we actually get to the point I want to make about sharpness. If you want to compare two swords, firstly, as said, you have to remove the two other variables, that being user skill and target, but you also need to remove the variable of sharpness. As such, if you compare two swords, they should have equal sharpness. I will be talking in more depth about this in the sword review section, as that's kinda what those reviews are for, at least when talking about cutting. Then about the sword itself. When it comes to cutting, the most important part is the blade, and more specifically the blade geometry. How long is it? How wide is it? How thick is it? What kind of a shape is it? Is it very thick? Is it flat? Is it hollow ground? And so on and so on. Naturally, the hilt components also play their part, but that's more in the handling department, as two swords with identical blades can handle very, very differently. In this case, handling means how easy it is to move the sword around, how easy it is to stop it, turn it around, keep the point in line, move the point around, how heavy does it feel, is it blade heavy or is the balance point close to the hand, and so on and so on. However, that being said, most of the actual cutting performance comes from the blade itself, because that is the part of the sword which will go through the target. This whole topic of how much the blade and the other parts of the sword actually contribute to the cutting capability of a sword is way out of the scope of this video. As I hopefully made already clear, you should separate the sharpness from the sword. Sharpness can change very rapidly, and on the other hand, if you take a good care of your sword, the sword itself stays more or less the same. If there's a major change to the sword, I'd consider it broken or changed in some other way. And when talking about sharpness, don't mix the sharpness of the sword to the edge profile. Ten cutting media, or as you might have noticed, the title of this section actually said tatami. This is because, in my opinion, the best cutting media there is good quality tatami. Clay can also be really good because you can literally use the same clay over and over again. So really your target doesn't change. With clay you just have to make sure that the target stays the same, in dimensions I mean. It has to be the same thickness and the same width every time you're cutting. And it should also be the same height as it's giving weight down on the blade when it's going through it. When it comes to other cutting media, such as water bottles or milk cartons and such things, they are not, in my opinion, really good. Their ability to give feedback on your cuts is rather limited, and their consistency can also vary greatly. Now to the tatami. But these points basically go for everything else you might cut. So the first thing is, what tatami have you actually chosen? Is it of a good quality? Is it really crappy beach mats which really don't give any, well, not any, they give some, but they don't give good feedback, let's say. Or are you using used Japanese checker pattern tatami, which can be actually quite hard to cut? What I'm going after with this is your tatami consistent? As you shouldn't use low quality tatami in the first place, or tatami-like materials, let's assume you have access to good quality tatami. However, not all good quality tatami are actually made equal. Let's say you are using used Japanese checker pattern style tatami. I would say that pretty much everyone agrees that it is good quality tatami. The issue here is that it's used, and thus the consistency of the tatami is not even. As such, if any way possible, you should stick to using a single type or single brand of tatami, and that brand or type of tatami should be such that it's of a good quality and it's consistent. So basically every mat you get from the supplier is just like any other. This is how you remove the variable of the target from the equation when you are trying to test either a sword or use a skill. Naturally, even though I used the checker pattern tatami as an example, if you know for certain that you can somehow source consistent quality of checker pattern tatami, it is okay, because as said, as long as the target is of consistent quality, it goes, but be careful with any tatami you buy. There are also other things when we are talking about tatami, and this is specifically for tatami. First, how long was the mat soaked? In my opinion, this is not up to an hour, so if there's a difference of an hour or two, it's not probably going to really make any difference. However, be careful, because if you sometimes only soak the tatami for 6 hours and some other times for 48 hours, there's definitely going to be a noticeable difference. Then, how consistently is the tatami rolled? As there is a difference between a loosely and a very tightly rolled tatami. This is especially important when you are doing competitions. You should have very clearly defined, consistent rolling rules for your mats, especially when there are multiple people rolling your mats. And lastly, how consistently is the tatami pegged? This can actually make quite a difference. Let's have a really simple example. You are doing a ascending cut on two different tatamis. The first is really loosely rolled and it is pegged on a really short peg. The second mat is extremely tightly rolled and it is pegged using a really long peg. I hope that for most people it should be immediately clear that it is going to be more difficult to cut the first mat. The cut has to be way better for it to go through the mat without knocking it out of the peg. As the second mat is tighter in the first place and it has more peg inside it, it's going to stick to the stand way more tighter. Thus, you can basically use more force to compensate a bad cut to get through the mat without actually knocking it out of the stand. Because of this, again, especially in competitions, you should always use the same length pegs and have the mats pegged as consistently as possible. This also means that the mat generally should be pegged in the middle and not somewhere to the side randomly. Then the user skill. So naturally this means how good of a cutter from a technical point of view the person cutting is. This means of course that the better cutter you are, easier it is to cut with a given sword, and you can actually still maintain a good quality cut with a so-called lesser cutting sword. There are many aspects to the skill of cutting, and this video is really not meant for going through that, as it will take considerable amount of time. I have a cutting series coming up, so keep an eye on that. For this video I will quickly take a look at two specific things when it comes to the skill of the user. The first one is what happens to your skill when you actually get tired. And I'll be taking a close look at this in the sword review section. The second thing is how used you are to the specific sword you are using. And I will be taking a closer look at that in the competition section. Now let's take a quick look at how these three different variables play into sword reviews. And in this specific case, of course, sword reviews which actually take a look at the cutting capacity of a sword. So firstly, if we are testing this sword, we want to remove the two other variables, those being the target and the user skill. So naturally, for anyone to be able to review the sword's cutting capability, they have to compare it to something else, basically other swords. That means that they have to be doing the cutting themselves. It also means that they have to be able to take into account their changing skill as a cutter, and generally this means that they are getting better and better. Of course, it can also mean that you haven't cut in a year and you are a bit rusty, so you also have to take that into account. In my opinion, the easiest way to do this is to have some kind of a standardized sword you use. So if you haven't cut in a year, just go and cut with that standardized sword and see then how the sword you are reviewing compares to that. And of course, as you get better as a cutter, using that standardized sword, you can see how much better you are getting. The one thing people probably don't think about is getting tired. So let's say you just received 5 swords and people are wanting you to review them. Naturally, you want to get the reviews out as soon as possible, and you take all the 5 swords and your standardized sword out and start cutting. The issue here is, if you are using, let's say, 3 mats per sword, when it comes to the 4th sword, you are probably getting a bit tired, and this is of course going to reduce your skill as a cutter. Well, not specifically your skill, but your performance as a cutter. How fast you get tired and how much it actually affects your cutting is of course, well, it varies on you, but it's going to have an effect. Because of this, if you want to have as objective view as you possibly can, you should not cut too much at once. So limit the number of your mats and keep necessary pauses so you don't get tired. So if you are going to test multiple swords at a time, try to keep the amount of the swords low, the amount of mats per sword low, and the time you take for breaks long so you don't tire yourself out. As said, how fast you tire and how much that affects your cutting is personal. The point of this is that it is important to understand that this actually plays a role. It would be rather sad to say that a sword is a bad cutting sword just because it happened to be the 10th sword you tested that specific day and you were extremely tired. So we have removed user skill from the equation. To test the sword, we also have to remove the target from the equation. As explained in the target section, you want to have a consistent target you are familiar with. As such, try to use the same brand of tatami, or let's say you are using water bottles because you have nothing else. Make sure you always buy the same water bottles because there can be actually a really big difference between brands in the thickness of the bottle and such things. You should also, in the case of tatami, of course, soak it the same way, roll it the same way, and peg it the same way. It is of course possible to switch between multiple different types of a target. There are basically 2 different scenarios for this. One, you are cutting multiple types of targets with a single sword. Or 2, you are cutting only a single type of target with each sword, but every now and then that target happens to change. So the first case, nothing changes. You basically compare the cuts to the same type of target to the cuts on with the other weapon to the cuts on the same type of target. So yeah, you are basically keeping the target consistent. You are just having multiple different types of targets for a better coverage. Now, on the second scenario, let's say you use two types of tatami because, well, you don't always have access to both of those. Let's say you've used both, but one was sold out, so you had to get the other one. This is still possible, but you have to be able to know the difference between the two target types. So basically you've had to at some point go and cut those two different targets back to back with the same sword. This gives you the ability to compare those two different target types. For example, I am very familiar with two brands of tatami, one from Tower Forge and one from Nine Circles, and I've done extensive cutting with both. Because of this, I can make quite an accurate comparison between cutting the Tower Forge tatami with one sword and cutting the Nine Circles tatami with another sword. Of course, this is not as good as being just able to cut one type of target all the time, but understand that if you are using two types of targets, you have to be familiar with them both, and you have to be able to compare them to each other. It is not a good idea to just buy two of these and never cut them with the same sword. So this is once again where your standard testing sword comes in. This gives you the ability to compare different targets, so you can then take that and still have somewhat accurate representation of how easy or difficult it is to cut with a given sword, even though you are technically using different targets. Now we get to the sword itself, what you are trying to test. And as said in the sword section, you have to separate the sword from the sharpness of the sword. These are two distinct things. For an example, let's make a completely blind cutting test scenario. So just now imagine that you can't actually distinguish what sword you are actually using. Basically all the swords in the world look exactly the same to you. First you get a sword which is shaving sharp, and you cut up the first tatami. The sword cuts extremely well and you are happy. Then you give the sword away and a second tatami is presented to you, and it's completely identical in every way to the first one. Now a sword is handed to you and you try to cut the tatami. It goes horribly. The sword is very dull and it doesn't really cut through the tatami, no matter how hard you try. The best you can do is use extreme force to force the sword through the tatami just barely. Now, obviously, you would say that the first sword is a good cutting sword and the second sword is a really bad one. But as said in the beginning, all the swords in the world look the same to you. So here's the catch. That was the exact same sword. Between the two mats, someone just went and dulled the blade. It's still sharp as in there is an edge, but it's basically as dull as it needs to be. You can basically just pull it over your hand and it's not going to cut anything. Now, this is rather imaginary situation, but let's say that you actually have two swords which are quite similar but not the same sword. One is extremely dull and the other is shaving sharp. The swords being very close to each other in other aspects, it would mean that the sharp sword is of course going to cut better. This should make it quite clear why you actually have to separate the sharpness of a sword from the sword itself when trying to compare different swords. Because of this, doing cut tests with the factory edge of a sword is really a rather bad way of trying to compare different swords to each other. I'm not saying the factory edge tests are completely meaningless, as they can give a basic idea to the possible customer what kind of an edge the sword has when it comes from the factory, but it should not be confused with doing a cutting test, which is actually testing the cutting capability of the sword. As the swords need to have a similar level of sharpness, there must be some way of actually making sure that the swords are, well, similarly sharp. For me, this means shaving sharp. It is easy to test. If it shaves your arm hair, it is sharp enough. And even if you go sharper than that, it really makes no difference, at least in my experience. I will just mention that in my opinion, the paper cutting test is not really good, as even though it seems that the sword cuts the paper just like the other, the actual sharpness of the edge can be widely different. So, in my opinion, the best way, without any microscopes or stuff like that, to make sure that your blades are always equally sharp is to have them shaving sharp. With this, we are able to remove the sharpness of the edge from the equation and actually test the sword itself, not the sharpness of the edge. Then cutting competitions. There are basically three types of cutting competitions, at least those I'm aware of. There's the bring your own sword competition, where each competitor brings their own sharp sword and uses that to compete. And usually this includes some kinds of parameters for the swords in question. They have to be of a specific size and blade type and so on. The second style is a tournament sword tournament, where the tournament provides the cutting sword for each competitor. So basically everyone is using the same sword. And the last is the hybrid of these two. So basically there is a tournament sword available for those who want to use it, but you are also allowed to bring your own sword as long as it fits the parameters of the tournament. In a cutting tournament, we are trying to test the skill of the cutters. This means that we should be able to eliminate the two other variables, those being the targets used and the sword. Now let's take a look at those three different types of tournaments from this point of view. So firstly we have the bring your own sword tournament, and let's get it out of the way right now. In my opinion, this is the worst possible way to hold a cutting tournament. In this kind of a tournament we are only removing a single variable, that being the target. Thus, we are not actually testing the skill of the cutter, we are also testing the sword they have. This means that it is possible to compensate for lack of skill with a better cutting sword, and of course compensate for a not so good cutting sword with more skill. Now this is an issue when you are actually trying to compete in cutting skill. And the issue here is that not all people have access to the same swords, and there are multiple reasons for this. The most obvious ones are that A. Good cutting swords tend to cost quite a lot, and B. Even if you have the money, the wait queues tend to be quite long. This means that even if you had the money to buy one, you still might not be able to get one because it just takes too long. In the worst case, this can make the competition rather uneven based on just what kind of an equipment people have access to. This naturally is the worst for those people who can't afford the best possible cutting swords. So this turns this at least partly to a equipment competition instead of just a competition of skill. But it's not all bad. The good thing here is that everyone can use a sword they are familiar with. Familiarity with a sword makes a difference, especially in the consistency of your cuts. This means that if you have a sword which is pretty good cutten but not the best, but you have hundreds and maybe thousands of practice hours with it, you can still outperform a better cutting sword simply with the help of the familiarity with your sword. And this can be a valuable option, as from the top of my head I think R.J. McKeon actually uses a cold steel hand and a half sword, but still, I would say that is the exception, not the rule. having a great sword is going to make a difference, and that difference can be between winning and not getting to the podium at all. Because of this, I think that bring your own sword tournaments are the worst way of holding a cutting competition. Next, the tournament sword option. This simply means that the tournament provides a cutting sword which every single competitor uses. In my opinion, in the most cases, this is the best option. Why I said in most cases, I'll explain a bit later. So what we are doing with a tournament sword option simply means that we are actually removing the sword from the equation. So now there's basically just the skill of the fencer, as the targets and the sword are the same in every case. The single negative thing here is if some people are very familiar with the type of sword used in the competition, let's say they either own an identical sword or have access to the actual sword used in the tournament, they have a small edge. This is because, as said just a bit earlier, being familiar with a specific sword can mean that you can actually cut with it better, especially your consistency tends to go up. But this being the only negative thing I can think of, in most cases, using a tournament sword is the best possible option for most competitions. Then the hybrid solution. So the tournament offers a sword to be rented or used for free, but the competitors can bring in their own swords and use those if they want to. This can be basically the worst or the best option. This depends on how this is implemented. Let's take a look at the worst case scenario first. This is the case in which the tournament sword is not good, so it's either not a good cutting sword to begin with, or it's dull, so it doesn't cut well even though it's okay or even a really good cutting sword. This means that those using the tournament sword are at a huge disadvantage against those who are able to bring even an average cutting sword, not even mentioning those who can bring in the best of the best of cutting swords to cut with. Now, how to do this properly? In my opinion, this can be the best option if and only if the competition is able to provide the best of the best cutting swords available within the rules of the tournament. Usually this could mean something like offering the Albion Principe for rent or to be used for free for anyone who wants to take part in the competition. Of course, this can be any extremely good sword, but Alexandria and Principe for Albion are the swords I'm familiar with, so I'm using those as an example. Don't think this as the only option. Now, what would this mean? This would mean that anyone who takes part in the competition can use the best possible sword available, or at least very, very close. This removes the case in which people bring in worse swords because they just don't have the ability to get a better one. Be it a monetary issue, not having the time to order one because of long queues, or simply living in a country where you are not allowed to own one. What this also allows is for people to choose to bring in their own sword they are familiar with if they want. In most cases, this would basically mean bringing just a slightly worse cutting sword you are really, really familiar with, because the familiarity factor can actually outperform the cutting capability difference of the two swords. In my case, this would mean that if a competition would offer me an Alexandria or a Principe, I would probably actually go in with my Precious Spadona because I have so much hours in with this. But on the other hand, if I had 3 months to train with Alexandria or Principe, I would use those. This would also leave open the option for those few people who want to actually use a considerably lesser sword to compete with because they just like that specific sword. And don't take this as an insult against any specific sword. At least in my opinion, it is just a fact of life that specific swords cut better than others. At least if someone is trying to claim that an Albion Alexandria is a worse cutting sword than Albion Ringek, the other being an 18C and the other being a very thick-bladed 15A, yeah, I wouldn't trust that person to make any claims about swords in general. So that was basically a really long way of saying that with a cutting competition, you should aim to test the skill of the competitors, not the equipment they have. What this means is that from the trio of sword, skill and target, you should try to eliminate the target and sword to the best of your ability. Before we get to the recap, go and tap the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. In test cutting there are three major variables, those being the sword, the target and the skill of the user. It is very important to separate the sharpness of the sword from the sword itself. It makes a huge difference, and the sharpness changes over the lifetime of a sword. The targets you are using should be able to give meaningful feedback, and they should be consistent. Remember that the skill of the user also includes the familiarity with the specific sword. To test the cutting capability of a sword, the user and the target must be the same. So must be the sharpness of the sword. The same sword can perform extremely differently when it's dull or really sharp. Thus it makes absolutely no sense to compare two different swords with different levels of sharpness. When testing swords, make sure you do not get too tired, as that will affect your performance. When holding a competition, think about, are you actually testing the skill of the competitors, or are you testing the equipment they are able to acquire?